From early days, I found that climbing was the only thing in life that gave me more than momentary satisfaction. Studies and work were always of secondary importance when it came to the mountains. I knew that if I was to give the majority of my life towards climbing, it would have to be at the top level of the sport, climbing the most difficult climbs and getting completely involved in the historical advance of mountaineering. Otherwise, I would quit and try something else. That is my nature.
Dougal Haston didn't quit. He climbed out of a turbulent youth tinged with violence and indeed death to become one of a handful of international mountaineers whose names in the 60s and 70s were as big as their mountains.
One day in 1954, Jim Moriarty, a school friend of the same age, known as Eley, and I were working along a disused railway track when Eley said, "Let's climb this wall."
My goodness. I took down memory lane. If you fell in the water, it would protect you. And it looks like the local council have spoiled a classic training route for us, having repointed all the holes that we were using.
No one in Currie had ever gone climbing. It was a sport for well-off people, and Currie was certainly not that kind of area. There was no money, therefore no equipment. Stunning 20-foot leaps into the water of Leith. 2 paper mills and a tannery poured their refuse into it. You emerged scraped and stinking to limp home like a leper.
Born Duncan McSporran Haston in 1940, Dougal, as he came to be called, Eley Moriarty and another friend, Jim Stenhouse, got their first taste of the Highland Hills through the local youth club. But it was following a chance encounter in the Pentlands with one of Scotland's greatest post-war climbers that tearaway high spirits started to harden into ambition.
My brother appeared with 3 boys who were from Currie. I think they were about 16 or something of that order. They asked about climbing, and Ronnie introduced me to them and said, show them some of the problems on the crag here. And these boys just latched onto it and climbed up it without any difficulty. And I was very impressed. And I thought, how wonderful to find young men climbing like that, and at such a young age, so they obviously showed great promise.
Promise required challenges, and none more beckoning than the gullies and buttresses of Buchel Etive Moor at the head of Glencoe.
They soon developed quite a vocabulary of skills. We took them winter climbing, and we said to Dougal and Jimmy Stenhouse, just go up that gully. And they went up it, you know, old army ice axes and big voluminous anoraks, and cut their way up this gully. It was their first winter ascent of a gully, but it was a new one. That was their apprenticeship. So they were thrown in at the deep end, so if they became good climbers or good ice climbers, that's how they earned it.
Still teenagers, Haston, Moriarty and Stenhouse, collectively the Currie boys, had a record and reputation many would be happy to retire on. But achievement that young merely feeds ambition, and rivalry whets the appetite. The rival Dougal found would turn out also to be an inspiration.
Dougal tells a story in his book about how he and Jimmy Stenhouse were camped over there on a very wet day, and they hadn't any thought of coming out of the tent. And they were at that time strong but ignorant schoolboys. Would that be a fair description?
It's a fair assessment.
So,
yeah.
Strong, ignorant schoolboys, about 17, and the door of the tent opened and Robin Smith poked his head around. And he was not much older than them, but a lot more experienced. And he proposed that they go and do a climb. And he took them to Revelation, which is a climb high up on that steep wall there. and was undoubtedly a test piece. And in the rain, an extremely testing piece.
Yeah, very, very testing.
So up they went, and Dougal describes it in his book as, you know, being an eye-opener, being an education for him.
That was a very good introduction to the fun of going on unclimbed rock and knowing that they could enjoy it.
Yes.
And it started, that really sparked off their attitude to good climbing.
And they would get a lot of comfort from the fact that they were able to keep their end up behind the sky that
Yes.
they knew about,
Yes.
and on this route that they had heard about.
That's right.
I was the only climber Dougal could find, and the only climber I could find was Dougal. He got to go with the times, so we swallowed a very mutual aversion to
Jim Curran and Tony Riley's film recreating the young tiger's first ascent in 1959 of a fearsome challenge on Ben Nevis draws on Smith and Haston's own written accounts.
When Robin Smith and I started climbing in the mid-1950s, one of the biggest and steepest crags in Scotland remained virtually untouched. The great buttress of Carn Gerrig had only 2 minor climbs, both sneaking up the easier angled section and avoiding the huge frontal face of overlapping cracks and corners. A few of us had designs on these, but no one had managed to make any significant progress. When we were together, it was always a game, each upstaging the other, trying to steal leads, gain the hardest pitch, steal each other's gear.
Good as Dougal's record was, Smith's record was just outstanding. He had been putting up new routes at that time, and new routes which are still regarded to this day as being difficult.
rattling sounds came from his throat. In his last throws to bridge, he threw his right foot away out at a straw on the wall, then his fingers went to butter. It began under control as the bit of news, "I'm off." But it must have been caught in the wind, for it grew like a wailing siren to a blood-curdling scream as a black and bat-like shape came hurtling over the roof with legs splayed like webbed wings and hands hooked like a vampire.
But Dougal, he would never give in. If we would take him out one of these odd climbs that we were doing, you'd find a hard bit. I often worked out a crack and things, and I would get some protection in. And that's quite tiring, you know, when you're on these overhanging bits. So I would come down for a rest and just say to Eley or Dougal, "Would you like to have a go?" Well, it was always Dougal who said, "I'll have a go," you know.
And have a go they did. Back on Ben Nevis for a second weekend, and after a fall by Smith to match Haston's, the bat was beaten in gathering darkness, with the pair of them, in Dougal's words, singing and crowing to the moon. In the autumn of 1959, age 19, Haston, like Robin Smith 2 years before him, enrolled at Edinburgh University as a philosophy student.
If you wanted to work at university, fine. If you didn't, that was fine too, provided you got around to it at some time or other. You can see why Smith and Haston, as students of the university here, were so successful as climbers. I remember one term, the pair of them went off to Chamonix in February to try to make winter ascents. They were off for 5 or 6 weeks, instead of bent over their desks as they would be today.
Back then, students perhaps enjoyed a higher social status than they do today. Certainly, members of the Edinburgh University Mountaineering Club had access to the premises of the august Scottish Mountaineering Club at 369 High Street.
The clubroom lay directly opposite St Giles Cathedral, and on one of these occasions, the morning after, because we all just lay where we fell after these parties, there's no question of going anywhere. So we lay where we fell, wrapped in the SMC's curtains on the floor. And on this particular morning, the jazz was on very loud, and we were hanging out the window in our string vests. And the Queen came up the Royal Mile to attend some ceremony at St Giles. A number of policemen came up the stairs, turned off the record player and told us to come out the windows, please, gentlemen.
He was pretty sort of difficult. He was a real stubborn bastard, you know. I mean, you could never tell him anything, to do anything, you know. Not in an unpleasant way. It was just, this man had this sort of grit. I used to, you know, be drunken evenings that ended up in the club rooms in the high street. We often ended up in wrestling matches and so on. And I occasionally, I mean, Dougal couldn't wrestle. I just sort of used to put a neck lock on him and drop him on the floor, you know, and I'm choking him to death on the floor and saying, "Submit, submit, you bugger." Never. It's the same when he's climbing.
In between hijinks in the high street and state-subsidised sorties into the French Alps, Glencoe and Ben Nevis were the staple of Haston and Friends' student climbing diet. The Scottish Mountaineering Club's exclusive LIGER hut in Glencoe was treated with the same respect as its Edinburgh club rooms.
With the help of a shoulder, I get onto the roof. It's beyond me now, but I can show you the general idea of it. Is to get a bit of height first of all, and then stand on the friend, and then you get the middle bit, unless it's rotten, and then into here, and one more step.
I think it was nicer in the old days, really, you know.
I preferred the old damp and dingy place, you know, where you felt you could knock hell out of the place quite happily.
So when Dougal improved the hut, he was just improving a dump, really.
It was a dump, yeah, and the weather was black, I think, for about 4 days. It was just rained. And he'd come into this hut, which was all painted lavatory green by the work parties diligently for 2-3 weekends. And he just thought, we must brighten this place up. Let's get some brightness and colour into this terrible bloody glen.
Dougal was a reputation long before people like me encountered him. Somehow they got the use of Lagan-Garov, and I came in one time and found that they'd made a most appalling mess to it.
Dougal was into Kandinsky because he was developing his intellectual capacities at that time, you know. So they painted a big background of sort of custard yellow all over the wall, and then big red lines, because these were the colours that were available. And as they got going, they became more and more excited.
The poor Kirkcaldy Club got the blame.
Yeah, I have.
Really?
I formally banned them from the use of the hut, and of course Dougal never forgave me for that. What really caused the end of my custodianship of Lagan-Garov was that Dougal came up for membership of the SMC, and I'm really surprised he wanted to be a member of the SMC because you know, he was rootedly hated the middle class. But anyway, he did apply, and he was given membership, and I said, well, I've just banned him from membership, so I really can't continue to be custodian.
Just a few hundred metres from Lagan-Garov, but at the opposite end of the social spectrum, is Jacksonville, home of Glasgow's Craigdhu Club. It hasn't changed much over the years.
Craigdhu were a group of hooligans, you know, who loved the mountains and had no organisation. That's how Dougal and Eley got on so well in climbing, because they broke down barriers here with these Glasgow climbers who were the undoubted best in Scotland.
And you were always welcome. I mean, nobody said, here you go, or something like that, you know. There was always a bed here, and a piece of the floor.
To the work hard, play hard ethos of the post-war period, the Craigdhu added a third imperative, climb hard, a call that Smith and Haston, Moriarty and Stenhouse made their own.
Water was pouring out of our ears, and our welly boots were like miniature ponds. The first pitch is a traverse from a safe ledge straight out across the wall. First taste of real exposure. Robin taking hours over the second pitch. Once or twice he slipped. Conditions and his decaying boots were terrible. His climbing was great.
Spectacular feats and wild times both were driven by the same electric energy that with Haston could at times short-circuit.
So we had a couple of pints and we sat around chatting, and I remember Dougal putting on some record, I think it was Rolling Stones or something, and we all got big, so started jumping about, and a very nice chap called Ken Grant. He started this kind of shadow boxing, sort of jumping about and sort of, you know, touching us with his hands, and I sort of defended myself and had a laugh and sat down, and Ken then went over to Dougal and started doing this, and I remember thinking to myself, Ken, I really wouldn't do that if I were you. And I was right, because Dougal suddenly just flipped and he just grabbed Ken and he punched him on the nose, and blood streaming from his nose, and he grabbed his hair and he kneed him in the face, and it was a horrible incident.
Classic routes and first ascents, Glencoe and Ben Nevis, Craigmeggy and the Cairngorms, Wales and the Lake District. The portfolio grew. Horizons widened, and the hard graft of summer pea-picking jobs was endured to finance trips to the Dolomites and the Alps. In 1962, Haston and Smith had been planning a first British ascent of the legendary north face of the Eiger. It wasn't to be. Smith had earlier accepted an invitation to join a British-Soviet friendship expedition in the Pamirs. He never came back. He was 24. But there still had to be a first British ascent of the Eiger. Haston chose a new partner, fellow Edinburgh student Andy Whiteman. After strong progress on their first day, Haston and Whiteman bivouacked for the night.
Cooking was just finished when there was a violent rush of hailstones on the tent sack. While we'd been brewing and contemplating, another Eiger storm had whipped in. This time it was no small one. All night it beat upon us. There could be only one decision in the morning: descent.
Abseiling down the Eiger when the north face is frozen solid is one thing. But the Eiger in summer, after an overnight storm, presented a frighteningly different set of hazards.
The second ice field was horrendous. We cowered and huddled on the upper rim as the water, ice and rocks shot out over the protective bulge. We knew that sometime we'd have to quit safety and make at least 3 abseils down the ice field.
Sentiamo delle scariche dall'alto che arrivano, no?
We heard stones coming down from above, quite a lot of stones. Then we heard voices, so we came out from where we were sheltering and saw these 2 climbers coming down, unroped. We didn't know who they were, and coming down, we couldn't understand what was going on.
Non si riusciva neanche a capire, no? E erano circa a distanza.
They were at a distance of about 50 or 60 meters over to the right from where we were, and quite a bit higher up. I watched as one of them started to come over the edge of the buttress, and then, whoom, he came clear off. It was dramatic, incredible, flying through the air for about 20 meters. Then he bashed off the face and started to slither on down till he was about level with us.
Ha battuto sulla cengia, no? Poi ha cominciato a scivolare giù, ma era alla nostra altezza.
I thought, Christ, he'll never stop. It's still 1,000 feet to the bottom. I quickly rushed downwards, but as I was climbing, a strange sight materialized. 2 climbers in yellow, shouting in Italian.
Stava scivolando su sto ghiaccio.
He was sliding in black ice, but we managed to get a hold of him and bring him over below the overhang. Shortly after that, the other climber arrived, Haston. Do we talk about what happens next? No, no way. We only speak Italian, they've only got English. Whiteman had broken a leg and sliced his cheek open. His helmet had come down over his head, that's what had saved him. He was completely out of it. So what do we do?
Lì niente presentazioni, cosa facciamo?
Then Nusdeo remembered that about 150 meters above, there was a waste vent for the tourist railway that the Swiss had tunneled all the way up through the mountain. He and his companion, Giuseppe Alipi, climbed up to fix safety ropes and pegs for Haston to bring up the injured Whiteman.
Andy was stubbornly insisting he could hop, but we worked out a compromise, whereby he sat on my shoulders and used his hands, while I provided the legs. It's difficult to look upwards with someone on your shoulders, a kind of 2-man man.
4 hours of awful, roaring darkness later, Haston and the 2 Italians got Whiteman to the safety of the railway gallery. Whiteman was on crutches for months, his climbing career over. For Haston, a Man of the Year nomination for his superhuman rescue effort was no consolation at all, for by then, the first British ascent of the Eiger had already been bagged by Ian Clough and the up-and-coming Chris Bonington. But the Alps had now become the field of dreams for Haston, and in 1963, after a successful second attempt on the Eiger with a Rhodesian Rusty Bailey, he decided to abandon his Edinburgh University studies. One factor in this decision was a friendship struck up in somewhat unusual circumstances.
The first time I met Dougal was in the public toilets at the camping site in Chamonix. He had fallen out with his climbing partner, and I had also with mine. And a friend in common introduced us, and that just happened to be while we were in the toilets at Chamonix. He was especially in those days, very dour, very taciturn, quite withdrawn, very introspective, not a great communicator.
Haston and Clark communicated well enough to record a number of impressive alpine routes together, and for Clark, a wealthy man by inheritance, to decide to bankroll Haston and Eley Moriarty in a bid to establish a climbing school based in Glencoe. There wasn't much of a business plan, and Hamish MacInnes, another of the great names of Scottish climbing, was already operating a similar venture. There was, however, a van to drive around in a Scotland where driving and drinking went practically hand in hand.
Did a route and decided to refresh ourselves in the LIGER Inn, because we stayed a bit longer than we should have. And it was Friday, as I recall. And we thought, right, back to Glencoe, because all the boys will be arriving, for the weekend, And of course, our session starts, And, 10:30 or something, well spilled out. And Dougal said, I'm going to drive. You've done all the driving all day. I said, come on, this, But he was in one of his moods, cussed moods, And, come over, it's quite an undulating road, just come over the Brother Hill. Horn was bang, And the next thing, the windscreen, I was sitting in the front, and the windscreen comes through, there was a big wide windscreen, and this guy's head his head and shoulders come through the windscreen. Jesus, hit me in the shoulder, and it just disappeared.
Well, I was there, of course, just after the accident. It was a horrendous accident, and I was with the local doctor, but it was a dangerous road. But I mean, Dougal had got drunk and shouldn't have been driving.
We didn't realise that Dougal had driven off. He must have panicked, He just, and he had stopped at the youth hostel, and of course the police were waiting for him at the youth hostel, And then, I don't know how many days later, but the poor chap died.
It was a very bad accident. Someone was killed, someone was very badly injured. And then he didn't report it, he didn't help the people who had been knocked over. And it was, I think, a bit of a surprise to everyone, really, that he got off as slightly as he did.
60 days in prison, a fine of £15, a 2-year driving ban. Haston thought better of an appeal and went to Barlinnie in July 1965.
I can't imagine, I never spoke very much about it. I can't imagine it'd be pleasant in Barlinnie, but he survived it, The thing he didn't survive was the accident, really. I mean, mentally,
I don't think Dougal showed the compassion or, the regret for that incident. And I think that was a fault on his side. But that was it, and he was young, and we're all wild, and unfortunately someone lost a life from it.
I remember once just talking about all the difficulties of getting to places. He says, why don't you get a car and go to these places? And he's quiet for a minute, and then he said that, would you drive again if you had an accident like mine, And he had a terrible burden with that accident. It really bothered him till the day he died,
I suspect before that accident, he was, he was laddish, and they were downright yobbish and downright unpleasant, basically. I only knew Dougal after that accident, and I think it completely changed his life. It changed his attitude to life.
It's undoubtedly a blight from which you do not easily recover. So, it makes perfect sense to me that he took the opportunity to go and work abroad when it came along.
He based himself, if you like, away from the UK, based himself in Switzerland. But I think that was primarily because that was a much better place to live. And he settled in Lausanne because it suited him absolutely perfectly. But I think it wasn't running away from Scotland.
Haston's Scottish Hound ice climbing skills had gained him a reputation that preceded him to the more extreme challenges of the Alps. One man who wanted him there was the charismatic John Harlan, an ex-American Air Force pilot turned director of the newly formed International School of Mountaineering in the village of LIGER. They made an unlikely pair, but for a long-dreamed-of first direct winter ascent of the north wall of the Eiger, Haston was the ideal lead, and the media-savvy American was the right man to raise the sponsorship.
Dougal came over, and I met Dougal at that time. And I found out, and John was surprised too, that Dougal not only was an absolutely magnificent ice climber, he also had a touch on rock that not many of us could match. This gangly guy, fairly tall, loose, just became a symphony. He could move up the rock very quickly. When he wasn't moving quickly, he meditated for a few moments, made the moves again. Watching him climb was like going out with Rudolf Nureyev and learning to ballet.
The Daily Telegraph magazine asked me to go and act as the photographer for the climb. And so out I went that winter. And then, of course, the whole thing developed into a huge circus. And I also got more and more involved. When we started climbing on the face, we were, in effect, having a race against the Germans.
An 8-man German team tackling the same route had started ahead of Harlan's, but the storms that battered the mountain put competition into perspective, with members of both teams pinned down in snow holes for days on end, until at last, abandoning what from the sidelines had been dubbed the slowest race in the world, the two teams joined forces. And then, disaster. A rope of a dimension thinner than Haston had wanted, but which Harlan had insisted upon, broke, with Harlan on the end of it. It was decided to go on. 3 days of storm and ice, skill and endurance later, on March 25th, 1966, Haston and 4 of the Germans reached the summit. In honor of the dead American, they named their climb the Harlan Route. Haston's achievement on a route then regarded as by far the hardest in the Alps was his passport for the major Himalayan expeditions. It also consolidated his move from Scotland to Switzerland. John Harlan's death had created a cruel vacancy into which Haston stepped as director of the International School of Mountaineering at LIGER. With its American residential school and its year-round tourism, LIGER, just a couple of hours from Geneva, was a honeypot for climbers and skiers from all over the world. Under Dougal's regime, the